The black Mercedes S-Class came to a violent stop in the gravel parking lot of Rosie's diner, spitting rocks and dust in every direction as Marcus Caldwell slammed the brakes harder than necessary. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, and the vein in his temple throbbed with the kind of rage that comes from a board meeting gone catastrophically wrong. 3 hours he'd been driving, no destination in mind, just putting distance between himself and the glass tower in downtown Portland, where his company's future had just been torn apart by a mathematical error nobody could solve. The Caldwell Solutions quarterly report sat in shambles. The algorithm that was supposed to revolutionize supply chain logistics had failed spectacularly during the investor presentation, and $20 million in venture capital had walked out the door with polite smiles and devastating rejections. Marcus yanked his tie loose, grabbed his leather briefcase, and stalked toward the diner like a man looking for something to break. The establishment was exactly what he expected from this godforsaken stretch of Nevada highway, a relic from the 1960s with faded turquoise paint, flickering neon, and windows so smudged with years of grease that you could barely see inside. He pushed through the door hard enough to make the bell clang violently, and immediately the smell of burnt coffee and old fryer oil assaulted his senses. There were maybe 5 other people in the place, truckers mostly, hunched over their plates and minding their own business, and behind the counter a woman who had to be pushing 70, looked up with the expression of someone who'd seen every kind of customer and wasn't impressed by any of them. But it was the waitress who caught his attention, not because she was particularly striking, though she had that kind of wholesome prettiness that came from youth and good bone structure, but because of the way she moved. She was wiping down a booth near the window with methodical precision, her movements economical and efficient, and when she glanced up at the sound of his entrance her eyes were clear and assessing, taking in his expensive suit and furious expression in one practiced sweep. Marcus chose a booth in the corner, as far from the other patrons as possible, and threw his briefcase onto the cracked vinyl seat opposite him with enough force to make it bounce. The waitress finished what she was doing, said something to the older woman behind the counter, and walked over with a laminated menu and a pot of coffee that looked like it had been sitting on the burner since the Clinton administration. She had a name tag that read Emma in faded letters, and she set the menu down in front of him with the kind of professional courtesy that came from years of dealing with difficult people. Marcus didn't look at her, just pointed at the coffee cup in front of him and said nothing, his eyes fixed on the table as if staring hard enough at the fake wood grain might somehow solve the unsolvable problem that was eating him alive. Emma poured the coffee without comment, and he could feel her waiting for him to order, could sense that patient stillness that service workers develop when they're dealing with someone who's clearly having a bad day. Finally he looked up at her, really looked, and saw a girl who couldn't be more than 23 or 24, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that were an unusual shade of grey-green, and something about her calm competence in the face of his obvious distress irritated him even more. She was waiting, pen poised over her order pad, and he realized with a flash of contempt that this was probably the height of her ambition, taking orders in a highway diner, living a small life in a small town, never aspiring to anything more than the next shift and the next tip. The thought crystallized something in him, all the frustration and failure of the day finding a target, and when he spoke his voice was cold enough to frost glass. He told her he'd have whatever was edible, which in a place like this was probably nothing. And when she started to list the specials he cut her off with a wave of his hand that was pure dismissal, treating her like she was part of the furniture, less than human, just another obstacle between him and the silence he needed to think. Emma's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those grey-green eyes, something that might have been recognition or might have been the kind of careful neutrality that comes from swallowing responses you can't afford to give, and she nodded once and walked away without another word. Marcus pulled out his laptop, opened the file that had haunted him for the last 6 months, and stared at the screen full of equations and variables that refused to align, the optimization problem that was supposed to be simple, elegant, solvable, but had instead become a labyrinth with no exit. And somewhere in this diner that smelled like desperation and broken dreams, with a waitress who probably couldn't count past 20 without using her fingers, Marcus Caldwell prepared to spend another fruitless night banging his head against a wall built of numbers that wouldn't cooperate. Emma brought the food 15 minutes later, a burger that actually looked decent and fries that were hot enough to still be steaming, and she set the plate down in front of Marcus with the same efficient grace she'd shown before, asking if he needed anything else in a voice that was professionally neutral, but carried an edge that suggested she'd already sized him up and found him wanting. He ignored her, eyes locked on his screen, one hand wrapped around his coffee cup while the other scrolled through line after line of code and calculations, and she stood there for exactly 3 seconds before turning to leave, which was when he made his first real mistake of the evening. He called her back, not by name but with that universal sound that people make when summoning service workers, that little throat-clearing noise that's somehow more dismissive than just saying "excuse me," and when she turned back to face him, his expression was the kind of condescending smirk that rich men wear when they're about to say something they think is clever. Marcus asked her if she'd gone to college, and the question hung in the air like a trap, and Emma's face went carefully blank in the way that meant she knew exactly where this was heading, and had decided to let him hang himself with his own rope. She said no, she hadn't, her voice steady and giving nothing away, and Marcus nodded as if this confirmed everything he'd suspected about her limited intellectual capacity and limited life prospects. He launched into a speech that he'd probably given a dozen times before, about the importance of education, about how people who didn't pursue higher learning were consigning themselves to lives of mediocrity, about how the world was divided into those who could think and those who could only do, and with every word his voice got more patronizing, more certain of its own superiority, until he was practically lecturing her, like she was a child who needed to be told that the sky was blue and water was wet. Emma listened without interrupting, her face a mask of professional courtesy, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the coffee pot, and Marcus was too wrapped up in his own brilliance to notice the way the other customers had stopped eating, to watch this train wreck unfold, too certain of his own righteousness to see the danger signs. He told her that uneducated people like her could never understand the complexities of real work, the kind of intellectual challenges that separated the successful from the ordinary, and he gestured at his laptop screen as if it were proof of some fundamental divide between their respective places in the universe's hierarchy. And then he made his second mistake, the one that would change everything. He said that the problem he was working on was beyond the comprehension of someone who'd never advanced beyond basic arithmetic, that it required years of specialized training and a level of abstract thinking that simply wasn't available to people who spent their lives serving food and wiping tables, and his tone suggested that he was being generous even explaining this much to someone of her limited capacity. Emma's expression finally shifted, something cold and sharp moving behind those grey-green eyes, and she set the coffee pot down on his table with a controlled precision that was somehow more threatening than if she'd slammed it, and when she spoke her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear, but carried the weight of something that had been building for a long time. She asked him what the problem was, and Marcus laughed, actually laughed, a short barking sound full of contempt and disbelief, because the idea that this diner waitress could have anything meaningful to contribute to his mathematical nightmare was so absurd it was almost funny. He told her it was an optimization problem, supply chain logistics, multivariable calculus combined with discrete mathematics, and he used the biggest words he could think of, like he was deliberately trying to make her feel stupid, deliberately trying to demonstrate the vast gulf between his world and hers, and Emma just nodded slowly and asked if she could see it. Marcus almost said no, almost told her to get back to work and stop wasting his time, but something in her tone made him pause, some quality he couldn't quite identify that suggested this might be entertaining, watching her try to make sense of equations that had stumped 3 different teams of highly paid consultants, and so he turned the laptop around with a theatrical flourish, like a magician showing that the box was empty before making the rabbit disappear. The screen showed a dense forest of variables and constraints, a problem involving the optimal routing of shipments across 17 distribution centers, with fluctuating demand, capacity limitations, time window, and cost functions that interacted in ways that created local minima everywhere you looked, trapping any solution attempt in suboptimal configurations that looked right but were fundamentally flawed. Emma leaned forward, her eyes scanning the screen with an intensity that seemed out of place given her supposed lack of education, and Marcus watched her with a smirk that said he was already composing the cutting remark he'd make when she inevitably admitted she had no idea what she was looking at. But then her expression changed. something shifting from confusion to concentration to something that looked almost like recognition, and she pointed at a section of code near the middle of the screen and asked a question that made Marcus's smirk falter because it was actually relevant, actually indicated some level of comprehension that shouldn't have been possible. Emma asked why he'd structured the constraint matrix asymmetrically when the distribution network itself was fundamentally symmetric, and Marcus felt something cold slide down his spine, because that was exactly the kind of question that someone who understood the deep structure of the problem would ask, not the kind of thing you stumbled onto by accident or guessed at randomly. He stammered something about computational efficiency, about how the asymmetric formulation allowed for faster processing, but even as he said it, he knew it was a weak answer, a justification he'd inherited from the previous team rather than something he'd thought through himself, and Emma was already shaking her head with a small frown that suggested she'd spotted the flaw before he'd even finished speaking. She pointed at another section, asking about the time window constraints and why they were modeled as hard limits rather than penalty functions, and Marcus felt his certainty crumbling because these were exactly the kinds of questions he'd been asking himself for months. The foundational assumptions that everyone had told him were standard practice, but had never felt quite right, and here was this waitress in a highway diner, picking apart his problem with the casual precision of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. He asked her how she knew this, his voice sharp with defensive anger, and Emma straightened up and looked at him with an expression that was hard to read, somewhere between pity and contempt, and she told him she'd studied mathematics at MIT for 3 years before her father got sick and she'd had to drop out to take care of him, and the medical bills had eaten everything they had, which was why she was working double shifts at a diner in the middle of nowhere instead of finishing her degree in applied mathematics and operations research. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, puncturing his assumptions with the force of objective reality, and suddenly the world realigned itself in uncomfortable ways, the comfortable narrative he'd constructed about educated people and uneducated people dissolving like sugar in hot water. Emma picked up a napkin from the dispenser on the table and asked if she could borrow his pen, and Marcus handed it over numbly, watching as she started sketching out equations with the smooth confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, her handwriting small and precise, each symbol placed with deliberate care, and he realized with a sick feeling that she was actually solving it, actually finding the path through the labyrinth that had trapped him for half a year. She wrote quickly, covering the napkin with a reformulation of the problem that introduced a different set of variables, a transformation that made the symmetric structure visible, and then she grabbed another napkin and kept going, building up the solution step by step, occasionally pausing to cross something out and try a different approach, but always moving forward with the kind of momentum that came from seeing the shape of the answer even before you'd fully worked it out. Marcus watched in silence, his burger going cold on his plate, his coffee forgot, his entire worldview cracking apart like thin ice under spring sun, and the other customers in the diner had given up any pretense of not watching. They were all staring now, witnessing something they didn't fully understand but recognized as important, as a moment when something fundamental shifted in the social order. Emma filled 3 napkins with mathematics, her pen moving with swift confidence, and then she stopped, tapped the final equation with one finger, and looked up at Marcus with an expression that dared him to find fault with her work. She explained that the key was recognizing that his problem wasn't actually a standard vehicle routing problem, but a variant that allowed for split deliveries and time-dependent costs, which meant the classical approaches wouldn't work because they were solving the wrong problem, and if he reformulated it as a network flow problem with side constraints and used a column generation approach with a specialized pricing sub-problem, he could solve instances with hundreds of distribution centers in reasonable time, not just the 17 he was currently struggling with. Marcus stared at the napkins, his trained eye recognizing immediately that she was right, that this approach would work, that it was elegant and efficient and exactly what he'd been searching for, and the realization brought with it a crushing weight of shame and humiliation that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with the casual cruelty he'd displayed 30 minutes earlier. He looked up at Emma and saw her watching him with those gray-green eyes that now seemed to contain depths he hadn't bothered to notice before, and he opened his mouth to say something, to apologize or explain, or somehow bridge the gap between the person he'd been and the person he needed to become, but the words stuck in his throat like broken glass. Emma picked up the coffee pot, refilled his cup with hands that were perfectly steady, and asked if there was anything else he needed, her voice professional and neutral, as if she hadn't just solved $1 million problem on 3 paper napkins, while standing in a diner that smelled like old fryer oil, as if she hadn't just demonstrated a level of intellectual capability that exceeded most of the people Marcus paid 6 figures a year to employ, and when he shook his head mutely she nodded once and walked away, leaving him alone with his cold burger, his useless pride, and the napkins covered in equations that represented both a solution to his problem and an indictment of everything he'd assumed about the world. Marcus sat in that booth for another 2 hours after Emma walked away, the diner gradually emptying around him as the evening shift wound down and the night crew came on, and he stared at those napkins like they were religious texts that might reveal some deeper truth if he contemplated them long enough. He'd taken photos of them with his phone, uploaded them to his secure cloud storage, and spent 90 minutes implementing Emma's reformulation in his optimization software, watching with a sick mixture of elation and self-loathing as the algorithm converged smoothly to an optimal solution in less than 3 minutes, solving in moments what had resisted months of effort by teams of specialists who'd cost his company hundreds of thousands of dollars in consulting fees. The improvement over his previous best solution was 17%, which translated to roughly $4 million in annual savings for his clients, which meant his company was no longer facing a catastrophic loss of credibility, which meant the investors who'd walked out this morning might actually return his calls, which meant Emma had just saved his business with 3 napkins and a borrowed pen, while earning $7 an hour plus tips. He tried to catch her eye several times, wanting to apologize, wanting to explain that he wasn't usually like this, that the stress of the failing company and the disastrous presentation had brought out the worst in him, but she moved through the diner with practiced efficiency, taking orders and delivering food and refilling coffee cups, and somehow she was never quite where he expected her to be, never quite available for the conversation he desperately needed to have. The older woman behind the counter, whose name tag read Rosie and who he assumed was the owner based on the diner's name, watched him with open suspicion, and he got the distinct impression that Emma had said something to her, had warned her about the rude customer in the corner booth, who'd decided to spend his evening insulting the staff. Around 10 o'clock the dinner rush ended, and the place became almost empty, just Marcus and 2 truckers who looked like they were settling in for the night. And finally Emma came over with a coffee pot and asked if he wanted a refill, her voice, still professionally neutral, but carrying an undertone that suggested she knew exactly what he was going through, and wasn't particularly sympathetic. Marcus said yes to the coffee and then, before he could stop himself, started apologizing, the words tumbling out in a rush that sounded desperate even to his own ears, telling her that he'd been wrong, that he'd been an arrogant ass, that there was no excuse for the way he'd spoken to her, and Emma listened without interrupting, her face giving nothing away. And when he finally ran out of steam, she poured his coffee and asked if that was all. The question was so matter-of-fact, so completely lacking in the forgiveness or understanding he'd been hoping for, that Marcus actually laughed, a short, sharp sound that held no humor, and he asked what he could do to make it right, and Emma's expression shifted into something that might have been amusement, or might have been contempt. She told him he could leave a decent tip, pay his bill, and drive back to whatever city he came from, with the understanding that education came in many forms, and intelligence wasn't limited to people with expensive degrees and corner offices. And then she could go back to her life, and he could go back to his, and they could both forget this evening had ever happened, which seemed like the cleanest solution for everyone involved. Marcus pulled out his wallet, extracted his business card along with $500 bill and set them on the table beside the napkins, and he told Emma that the money wasn't a tip, it was a consulting fee, because she'd just provided work product that was worth significantly more than what he was paying, and if she was interested he'd like to offer her a position at his company, doing exactly the kind of mathematical optimization she'd just demonstrated. Emma looked at the money, like it was a snake that might bite her, and when she looked back at Marcus her eyes were cold enough to freeze water, and she told him she didn't need his charity or his guilt-motivated job offers, that she'd been surviving just fine on her own for 3 years, and would continue to do so, and that solving his problem had been an intellectual exercise, nothing more, a way to scratch an itch she hadn't been able to scratch since leaving MIT, and she didn't want anything from him except for him to finish his coffee and leave. The rejection stung worse than anything that had happened in the board meeting, Worse than the investors walking out, worse than 6 months of failure, because it was personal and it was deserved, and there was no algorithm that could solve it, no reformulation that would make the solution appear, just the raw reality that some bridges burn completely and some damage can't be undone with money or apologies or good intentions that came too late. Marcus gathered his things, left the money on the table despite Emma's protest, and walked out into the Nevada night, feeling smaller than he had when he'd walked in, the desert air cool against his face, the stars overhead indifferent to human dramas playing out in roadside diners, and he sat in his Mercedes for a long time before starting the engine, staring at the neon sign that read Rosie's Diner, and wondering how many other brilliant people were out there, their talents wasted or hidden, their potential unrealized because the world had decided they were worth less than the paper their paychecks were printed on. Marcus drove through the night, reached Portland by dawn, went directly to his office without stopping at home, and spent the next 72 hours learning everything he could about Emma Catherine Morrison, which turned out to be significantly more than he'd expected, and infinitely more impressive than his worst assumptions had suggested. She'd graduated high school at 16, entered MIT on a full academic scholarship with perfect SAT scores, and a recommendation letter from a Fields Medal winner who'd taught her in a summer program, and spent 3 years absolutely dominating the mathematics department with a focus on operations research and combinatorial optimization, before everything fell apart in ways that had nothing to do with her academic performance and everything to do with life's cruel randomness. Her father, David Morrison, had been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's at 52, a devastating diagnosis made worse by the fact that he was a single parent who'd raised Emma alone after her mother died in a car accident when Emma was 8, and the progression had been rapid and brutal, taking him from fully functional to requiring constant care in less than 18 months. Emma had withdrawn from MIT in the middle of her junior year, moved back to Nevada to care for him, and watched her father slowly disappear into confusion and rage, and eventually a blank-faced docility that was somehow worse than the anger, and the medical bills had consumed their savings, then their house, then every asset they'd accumulated, leaving Emma working double shifts at Rosie's Diner to pay for a care facility that kept her father comfortable while his mind continued its inexorable retreat from reality. Marcus found all this through a combination of university records he had no business accessing but did anyway, social media profiles that Emma barely maintained, and a long phone call with one of her former professors who remembered her as the most naturally gifted mathematician he'd taught in 30 years, and spoke of her departure from the program with the kind of sadness usually reserved for discussing premature deaths. The professor told Marcus that Emma had been working on a thesis about dynamic optimization in stochastic networks that had the potential to revolutionize supply chain management, that she'd already published 2 papers in peer-reviewed journals before leaving school, and that losing her from the program had been like watching a star go supernova, brilliant and tragic and wasteful, and he'd tried to keep the slot open for her, tried to arrange for remote study and extended leave, but eventually the bureaucracy had won, and Emma had become just another student who didn't finish, her transcript marked with a withdrawal that told nothing about the circumstances or the loss. Marcus learned that Emma's father was currently in a facility called Sunrise Care, that the monthly cost was $3,800, that Emma was exactly 4 months behind on payments and the facility was threatening to discharge her father to a state-run institution, and that she was picking up extra shifts wherever she could find, working 70 and 80-hour weeks, surviving on coffee and determination, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that you couldn't teach in any business school. He learned all this while simultaneously implementing Emma's solution to his optimization problem, running tests and simulations that confirmed what he'd already known, that her approach was not just correct but brilliant, elegant in its simplicity and powerful in its generality, applicable to a whole class of problems that his company's clients were struggling with, potentially worth tens of millions of dollars in new contracts if he could productize it properly. The ethical implications of using her work without proper compensation gnawed at him, but he told himself he was going to make it right, going to find a way to pay her what she deserved, and he drafted offer letters with salary figures that made his CFO choke on her coffee, equity packages that would make Emma a significant shareholder in the company, and a benefits package that included full health coverage and tuition reimbursement for finishing her degree. And all of this felt simultaneously generous and insufficient, like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. He had his executive assistant call the Sunrise Care Facility and pay Emma's outstanding balance plus 6 months in advance anonymous, and he knew she'd figure out it was him, but he did it anyway, and he tried to call her at the diner 3 times but hung up before anyone answered because he didn't know what to say, didn't know how to bridge the gap between his guilt and her justified anger, between his desire to fix things and her right to tell him to go to hell. By the end of the 72 hours, Marcus looked like death warmed over. His office was a disaster of coffee cups and printouts and scribbled notes, and he'd come to 2 conclusions that felt simultaneously obvious and revolutionary. First, that his company needed to completely rethink how they identified and recruited talent, because the traditional credential-based system was missing people like Emma who were 10 times more capable than anyone in his current engineering team. And second, that he'd been living his entire professional life with blinders on, assuming that the world's hierarchy was meritocratic when it was actually just a reflection of who'd had the opportunity and resources to develop their potential, which wasn't the same thing at all. Marcus drove back to the diner on Friday evening, timing his arrival for the end of Emma's shift based on a schedule he'd obtained through means he preferred not to examine too closely, and he found her walking across the parking lot toward an ancient Honda Civic that looked like it was held together by rust and prayer, and when she saw him leaning against his Mercedes, her expression went from tired to coldly furious in the space of a heartbeat. She demanded to know what he was doing there, her voice sharp enough to cut glass, and Marcus held up his hands in a gesture of surrender and said he needed to talk to her, needed to explain some things, and Emma's laugh was bitter and humorless, and she told him she didn't need or want his explanations, that whatever guilt he was feeling was his problem to solve, not hers, and would he please leave her alone so she could go home and sleep for a few hours before her next shift started. Marcus asked her if she'd received any unusual communications from Sunrise Care, and Emma's expression shifted from anger to suspicion, and she asked what he'd done, her voice low and dangerous, and Marcus told her he'd paid her father's bills, not as charity, but as a down payment on what he owed her for solving his optimization problem, and Emma's face went through several emotions in rapid succession before settling on a kind of cold rage that was more frightening than shouting would have been. She told him he had no right to interfere in her life, that she hadn't asked for his help and didn't want it, that his money couldn't buy forgiveness or assuage his guilt, or make him feel better about being a judgmental ass who'd treated her like garbage, and every word hit Marcus with the force of truth, and he found himself nodding because she was absolutely right, and there was no defense he could offer that wouldn't sound like excuses. He pulled out the folder he'd brought, containing the offer letter and equity agreements and benefits package, and he told Emma that this wasn't about charity or guilt, it was about business, about the fact that she demonstrated capabilities that his company desperately needed, and he was prepared to pay market rate, plus a significant premium to secure her services. And Emma looked at the folder like it was contaminated and told him she wasn't interested in his pity job. Marcus felt his own temper rising, which was probably unwise, but he was tired and stressed and had spent 3 days working himself into the ground trying to fix a situation that apparently couldn't be fixed, and he told her with more heat than he'd intended that this wasn't pity, it was recognition of value, that her solution to his problem was already generating new client interest worth millions of dollars, and she deserved compensation for that contribution. And furthermore, if she'd just listened for 5 minutes instead of being so stubborn, she'd realize that this offer could solve her financial problems and let her go back to school and actually use the gifts she'd been given instead of wasting them, taking orders from truckers. The words came out wrong, too aggressive, too much like another lecture from someone who thought he knew better, and Emma's face went carefully blank in that way he'd learned meant she was controlling her anger through sheer force of will, and she told him very quietly that her life wasn't a waste, that taking care of her father and working an honest job weren't shameful things that needed to be rescued from, and that his inability to see value in work that didn't come with a fancy title said more about his limitations than hers. Marcus felt the conversation slipping away from him, felt the moment when reconciliation might have been possible receding like the tide, and he made a desperate attempt to salvage something by telling Emma that he wasn't explaining himself well, that he knew he'd been wrong, and he was trying to make it right. Would she please just look at the offer because the numbers spoke for themselves? Emma took the folder, opened it, and her eyes widened as she scanned the salary figure and the equity percentage, and for a moment Marcus thought he'd gotten through to her, thought the sheer financial reality would overcome her justified anger, But then she closed the folder and handed it back to him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She told him the offer was impressive, probably more money than she'd make in a decade at the diner, but she was going to decline because accepting it would mean validating his worldview, would mean agreeing that her life needed fixing and that his guilt-driven intervention was somehow noble rather than condescending. She refused to participate in his redemption arc at the cost of her own dignity, and with that she turned and walked to her car, got in, and drove away, leaving Marcus standing in the parking lot holding a folder full of numbers that meant nothing, and legal documents that would never be signed. The desert wind blew dust across the gravel and the sun sank lower toward the horizon, and Marcus realized that some problems couldn't be solved with money or mathematics or good intentions, that some damage was permanent, and some bridges couldn't be rebuilt no matter how much you wanted. Marcus didn't leave. Instead, he went back into the diner and sat at the counter nursing coffee that tasted like battery acid while Rosie cleaned up after the dinner rush, and eventually she came over and told him point blank that he needed to either order something or get out because she didn't run a therapy center for guilty rich people, and Marcus surprised himself by laughing, a real laugh this time, and he asked Rosie if she had a few minutes to talk. Rosie looked at him with the evaluating stare of someone who'd spent 50 years reading people, and apparently she saw something worth her time because she poured herself a cup of the terrible coffee and sat down on the stool next to him, and Marcus found himself telling her everything, the whole story, from the board meeting, to the insults, to the napkin mathematics, to his failed attempts at making amends, and Rosie listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of acknowledgement, and when he was done she sat in silence for a long moment before speaking. She told Marcus that he'd approached the whole situation wrong from the beginning, that he'd treated Emma like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected, that his offers and his money and his guilt were all about making himself feel better, rather than actually understanding what Emma needed or wanted, and every attempt to fix things had just dug the hole deeper because he was still operating from the same place of assumed superiority, still believing that his way of seeing the world was correct, and Emma just needed to be convinced to accept his generosity. The words were harsh, but Rosie delivered them in a matter-of-fact tone that somehow made them easier to hear than if she'd been angry, and Marcus felt something shift inside him, some fundamental recalibration of perspective that was painful but necessary, like a dislocated joint being forced back into place. Rosie told him about Emma's history, about how she'd started working at the diner when she was 16, still in high school, saving money for college because even with scholarships there were expenses that needed to be covered, about how she'd been the valedictorian and the star of the math team, and could have gone anywhere but chose MIT because it was the best program for what she wanted to study, and about how she'd come back 3 years later changed by grief and responsibility but not broken, not defeated, still fundamentally herself. She told Marcus about the regulars who came to the diner specifically to be served by Emma, about the truck driver, whose kid she'd tutored in mathematics over coffee refills until the kid got into college, about the traveling salesman whose business she'd helped optimize using cocktail napkin calculations, just like she'd done for Marcus, about the teenager who'd been considering dropping out of school who Emma had mentored and encouraged until the girl graduated and went on to community college. And Rosie's point was clear even before she made it explicit, that Emma had been using her gifts all along, but the idea that she was wasting her potential was Marcus's failure of imagination rather than Emma's failure of ambition. Marcus asked what he should do, and Rosie told him there might not be anything he could do, that some mistakes had consequences that couldn't be fixed with grand gestures, but if he was genuinely interested in making amends rather than absolving his guilt, then he should start by actually listening to Emma, rather than telling her what she needed, and by accepting that she had every right to reject his offers and his apologies and his presence in her life, and that respecting her choices was more important than assuaging his conscience. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, Marcus had filled 3 more cups with the terrible coffee, and had come to understand that his entire approach to people and business and life had been built on assumptions he'd never examined, on beliefs about merit and value that were convenient for someone in his position, but didn't actually reflect reality. And Rosie watched this realization dawn on his face, with the patient expression of a teacher who'd seen students struggle with difficult concepts before, and knew that understanding came in its own time. Marcus asked Rosie if Emma had ever mentioned wanting to go back to school, and Rosie said that Emma talked about it sometimes, late at night when the diner was empty and her defenses were down, that she missed the work and the intellectual challenge and the feeling of pushing at the boundaries of human knowledge, but that she'd made peace with her choices, and wasn't the kind of person to waste time on regret or self-pity, and that her father's care was her priority and everything else was secondary, and she'd made that decision with full awareness and agency and didn't need anyone second-guessing. Marcus asked if there was any way to help that wouldn't be insulting or condescending, and Rosie's smile was sad and knowing, and she told him that the best thing he could do was probably to leave Em alone and let her live her life on her own terms, but that if he was determined to do something useful, he might consider how many other people like Emma were out there, brilliant and capable and trapped by circumstances beyond their control, and whether his company and his influence might be used to create opportunities for people who'd been written off by traditional systems, and that would be a better legacy than trying to fix one situation that he'd already broken beyond repair. Marcus spent the next 3 months transforming his company in ways that made his board of directors nervous, and his traditional investors uncomfortable, but he'd stopped caring about comfort and started caring about effectiveness, which turned out to be a different thing entirely. He established the Morrison Fellowship, a fully funded program that identified talented individuals who'd been unable to complete their education due to circumstances beyond their control, and provided not just tuition but living expenses, healthcare and support services that recognized that adult learners had complex lives that couldn't be paused for the convenience of academic calendars. He restructured his company's hiring practices to eliminate degree requirements for technical positions, instead focusing on demonstrated ability through work samples and practical assessments, and he hired a consulting firm that specialized in finding overlooked talent in unconventional places, and within 2 months his engineering team had expanded to include a former Army logistics specialist who'd never gone to college, but had optimized supply chains in active war zones, a self-taught programmer who'd learned coding in prison, and had developed algorithms that rivaled anything coming out of Stanford, and a grandmother who'd spent 30 years doing mental mathematics for her small business before someone noticed she was doing things that normally required specialized software. The changes were disruptive and controversial, and Marcus lost 2 senior vice presidents who couldn't adapt to the new culture, but the results were undeniable, with his company's innovation metrics and client satisfaction scores climbing steadily as the new hires brought fresh perspectives and unconventional approaches to problems that had been stagnant under traditional thinking. He gave talks at conferences about rethinking talent identification, about the vast pool of human potential that was being wasted because it didn't come packaged in the right credentials, and some people listened while others dismissed him as naive or virtue signaling. Marcus didn't particularly care either way because he'd seen the evidence and knew he was right. The Morrison Fellowship's first cohort included 12 people from 8 different states, ranging in age from 22 to 50, and Marcus quietly made sure that Emma was informed about the program even though he knew she'd probably see through the gesture, and he was right, she didn't apply. But 3 people from similar situations in Nevada did, and one of them was the teenager Emma had tutored, and Marcus took some small satisfaction in that, even if it wasn't the outcome he'd hoped for. He went back to Rosie's diner once, 4 months after the parking lot confrontation, and Emma was there, but she saw him come in and immediately went to the bar, and Marcus sat at the counter and had coffee with Rosie, and didn't try to force a conversation, just left an envelope containing printed copies of Emma's published papers and a note saying that he'd cited her work in 3 patent applications, and the royalty checks would be sent directly to her, no strings attached, and he'd never know if she'd read the note or torn it up, but at least he'd tried. The company's use of Emma's optimization approach had generated $14 million in new contracts, and Marcus had instructed his legal team to establish a trust that would pay Emma 10% of all revenue derived from her methodology in perpetuity, and the first check was for $1.4 million, and he'd sent it certified mail with a letter explaining that this was her intellectual property, and she had every right to the compensation regardless of how she felt about him personally, and he'd waited for a response that never came, and eventually he'd accepted that some bridges stayed burned and some relationships never recovered, and that was just how life worked sometimes. His company continued to grow. The Morrison Fellowship expanded to include 50 students in its second year, and Marcus's reputation in the industry shifted from successful entrepreneur to someone who was genuinely trying to make systemic change, and he gave interviews where he talked about the diner waitress who'd revolutionized his thinking, never using Emma's name, but making it clear that one encounter had fundamentally altered his understanding of talent and potential and human value. He dated occasionally but nothing serious, spent time with his nieces and nephews, and tried to be the kind of uncle who asked questions and listened to answers, volunteered with organizations that helped adults complete their education, and generally tried to become a person who wouldn't have made the mistakes he'd made in that diner. And some days he succeeded, and some days he didn't, but at least he was trying. The terrible irony was that Emma's methodology had become the cornerstone of his company's competitive advantage, which meant he thought about her every day, saw her influence in every successful client implementation, knew that his current success was built on 15 minutes of napkin mathematics from someone he'd insulted and dismissed, and the knowledge was simultaneously gratifying and humbling, a constant reminder that the world was full of people whose value he'd been trained not to see, and that his education and his success had blinded him more than they'd enlightened him, and unlearning that blindness was the work of a lifetime. Emma stood outside the MIT mathematics building on a cold October morning 2 years after the diner encounter, her visitor's badge clipped to her jacket, and tried to remember how to breathe normally, because being back on this campus brought up emotions she'd spent years carefully packing away in boxes she never opened. Her father had died 6 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep at the Sunrise Care Facility, and the grief had been complicated by relief, which brought its own guilt. The terrible truth that watching someone you love disappear, piece by piece, is sometimes harder than the final loss, and that death can be a mercy, even when it breaks your heart. The life insurance policy she hadn't known existed had paid out enough to cover the remaining facility bills with some left over, and Emma had taken exactly 2 weeks off work to handle the funeral and estate, and then had gone right back to her shifts at Rosie's, because staying busy was easier than sitting alone with her thoughts, and she'd convinced herself she was fine until the day she wasn't. The breaking point had come on a Tuesday afternoon when she'd been wiping down tables and overheard 2 college students talking about their operations research class, and the familiar terminology had hit her like a physical blow, reminding her of everything she'd given up, everything she'd lost, and she'd excused herself to the bathroom and cried for 20 minutes before splashing cold water on her face and going back to work. And that night, she'd pulled out the old MIT course catalog she'd kept buried in a box in her closet and started looking at what it would take to return. The Morrison Fellowship had contacted her 4 times over the past 2 years, each letter more detailed than the last, and she'd thrown the first 3 away unopened because she'd known who was behind it, and hadn't been ready to accept anything that felt like charity from Marcus Caldwell. But the 4th letter had arrived a month after her father's death, and she'd been raw enough and tired enough and lonely enough that she'd actually read it, and the terms were generous enough that she'd allowed herself to consider the possibility of returning to school, and here she was, meeting with her former advisor to discuss the feasibility of completing her degree. Professor Chen looked older than she remembered, his hair fully gray now instead of salt and pepper, but his smile was warm and genuine as he welcomed her into his office, and immediately launched into a discussion of recent developments in network optimization theory, and Emma felt something loosen in her chest as she realized she could still follow the mathematics. That 2 years away hadn't eroded the fundamental understanding she'd built, and the conversation flowed with an ease that reminded her why she'd loved this work in the first place. Chen told her that her previous work was still relevant, that in fact one of her papers had been cited in 17 subsequent publications and was considered foundational in a subfield of dynamic routing problems, and that if she wanted to return there would be a place for her, not as charity but as a recognition that she'd already proven her capabilities and deserved the chance to complete what she'd started. Emma asked about the Morrison Fellowship, asked point blank if it was connected to Marcus Caldwell, and Chen's expression became carefully neutral as he confirmed that yes, Caldwell's company was the primary funder, but that the selection process was independent and based solely on merit and need, and that Emma had been recommended by 3 different faculty members before anyone knew about her connection to Caldwell, and that she'd earned this opportunity through her previous work rather than through any kind of pity or guilt-driven intervention. The distinction mattered to Emma more than she could articulate, the difference between being rescued and being recognized, and she asked for time to think about it, and Chen said of course, take all the time she needed, but he hoped she'd accept because the field needed people like her, people who could see problems from unconventional angles and weren't constrained by traditional thinking, and losing her the first time had been bad luck, but losing her twice would be a tragedy. Emma walked around campus for 3 hours after the meeting, visiting old haunts and seeing how much had changed and how much had stayed the same, and she thought about her father who'd always believed in her potential even when she couldn't see it herself, and about Rosie who'd given her work and stability when she'd needed it most, and about Marcus Caldwell who'd been a catalyst in ways that were complicated and uncomfortable but ultimately undeniable. She thought about the trust fund check that had arrived 18 months ago, the one she'd initially refused to cash because it felt like blood money, like accepting payment for something she'd done out of intellectual curiosity rather than commercial interest, but which she'd eventually deposited because pride was expensive and her father's medical bills were real, and that money was sitting in a savings account gathering interest because she hadn't known what else to do with it, hadn't felt like it was really hers even though legally it was. She thought about the years she'd spent at Rosie's diner, the regulars she'd helped and the problems she'd solved and the quiet satisfaction of being useful even in small ways, and she realized that none of it had been wasted, that every experience had shaped her and taught her things she couldn't have learned in a classroom, and that returning to MIT didn't mean those years had been a detour, but rather that they'd been preparation for a different kind of journey. Emma made her decision standing in front of the infinite corridor, watching students rush past on their way to classes and remembering what it felt like to be one of them, to be part of something larger than yourself, to be pushing at the boundaries of human knowledge in however small a way. And she pulled out her phone and called Professor Chen and told him she'd accept the fellowship, not because she'd forgiven Marcus Caldwell, or because she'd stopped being angry about their first encounter, but because she'd finally learned the difference between accepting help and accepting defeat, and this was the former even if it came wrapped in complicated circumstances. Marcus received the email from Professor Chen informing him that Emma had accepted the Morrison Fellowship, and he felt a complicated mixture of relief and trepidation, because he genuinely wanted her to return to school, but he'd also known that her acceptance might mean having to face her again, and he wasn't sure he was ready for that encounter even after 2 years of personal growth and systemic change. He didn't reach out, didn't try to force contact, just sent a brief congratulatory note through Chen and then deliberately stayed away, giving Emma space to rebuild her academic career without his presence complicating things, and he threw himself into work and philanthropy, and tried not to think about the what-ifs that haunted quiet moments. Emma completed her degree in 18 months, working with an intensity that impressed even her advisor, and her thesis on adaptive optimization in uncertain environments was published in a top-tier journal, and generated immediate interest from both academic and industrial researchers, and she graduated with honors and multiple job offers from companies that had nothing to do with Marcus Caldwell, and she accepted a position at a research institute that valued both theoretical elegance and practical application, and she moved into a small apartment near campus, and adopted a cat and started building a life that felt authentically hers rather than a reaction to circumstances beyond her control. 3 years after the diner encounter, Marcus was invited to give a keynote address at an operations research conference, and he accepted without checking the program carefully, and it wasn't until he arrived at the venue that he saw Emma's name on the speaker list, scheduled to present her research in the same session where he'd be speaking, and his first instinct was to withdraw, but he recognized that impulse as cowardice and forced himself to stay. Emma's presentation was brilliant, clear and compelling, and demonstrating a level of sophisticated thinking that went far beyond what she'd shown on those diner napkins, and Marcus watched from the back of the room, feeling a complicated pride that he had no right to claim, and when she finished the audience asked sophisticated questions and Emma answered them with confidence and precision, and Marcus realized that she'd become exactly what he'd always suspected she could be, not because of his intervention but despite it, and the distinction was important, even if it was painful. They ended up in the same coffee shop after the session, not by design but by the kind of coincidence that felt inevitable, and Marcus considered leaving, but Emma saw him, and after a long moment of evaluation she nodded toward an empty table, and he took that as an invitation, and they sat across from each other with coffee, neither of them particularly wanted, and neither of them spoke for a solid minute. Emma broke the silence by thanking him for the fellowship, her voice neutral and professional, and Marcus started to say it wasn't necessary, but she held up a hand and continued, saying that she'd spent 3 years being angry about their first encounter and she'd earned the right to have her say without interruption. She told him that what he'd done that night at the diner had been genuinely harmful, that his assumptions and his arrogance had cut deeper than he probably realized, but that she'd also come to understand that people were capable of change, and that his subsequent actions, while not erasing the original harm, had at least demonstrated a willingness to learn from mistakes, and that was worth something even if it didn't require or deserve forgiveness. Marcus listened without trying to defend himself, and when Emma finished, he said simply that she was right, that he'd been wrong in ways that went beyond just that one evening, and that meeting her had forced him to confront assumptions he'd built an entire career on, and while that didn't absolve him of responsibility, it had at least made him a different person than he'd been. They talked for 2 hours, the conversation gradually shifting from their past encounter to their current work, and Marcus found himself genuinely interested in Emma's research, not as a way to exploit it, but as intellectual engagement with a peer, and Emma relaxed enough to share some of the challenges she was facing with her current project, and Marcus offered some suggestions based on his company's experience that Emma actually found useful, and by the end they'd sketched out the outline of a potential collaboration that would benefit both their organizations without creating a power imbalance that would make Emma uncomfortable. They exchanged professional contact information, and Emma told Marcus that she wasn't offering friendship or forgiveness, but she was willing to engage professionally if he could respect boundaries and treat her as an equal, and Marcus agreed immediately because that was more than he'd expected and more than he probably deserved. Over the next several years they interacted occasionally at conferences and through collaborative research projects, always professional, always respectful, and gradually the sharp edges of their shared history softened into something that wasn't quite friendship but wasn't purely business either, a complicated relationship built on mutual respect that had been hard-won and was therefore more valuable than easy affection would have been. Marcus's company continued to grow, the Morrison Fellowship expanded to multiple universities, and his reputation evolved into someone who'd made mistakes but had learned from them, which was about as good as anyone could hope for in an imperfect world. Emma became a leading researcher in her field, published extensively, mentored students who reminded her of herself, and occasionally thought about that night at the diner with a complicated mixture of anger and gratitude. Anger for the harm that had been done, and gratitude for the catalyst it had become, and she'd learned that life rarely offered clean narratives of redemption or revenge, mostly just messy stories about imperfect people trying to do better than they'd done before. Years later, when Marcus was asked in an interview about the pivotal moments in his career, he talked about a waitress who taught him that education came in many forms and intelligence wasn't limited to people with the right credentials, and he didn't use Emma's name because she'd asked him not to, but he was honest about his own failures and about how being wrong in a fundamental way had been the best thing that ever happened to him, even though it hadn't felt like it at the time. And somewhere in a research lab 3,000 miles away, Emma heard about the interview and smiled slightly and thought that maybe eventually they'd both learn something worth knowing.